Jennifer Scott. I'm the director here at the museum. I want to thank our wonderful moderator and panelists who you'll meet in a minute or so, and all of you for coming out for this very, very historic reunion and discussion of the West Side Writers Guild. And to quote from the dedication in their landmark published work, Guild Works, Writings from the West by the West Side Writers Guild. We are here tonight to celebrate the indomitable spirit of the people of the West Side of Chicago. A few more thank yous. I'd like to thank our funders, National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as our partners, the Guild Literary Complex and our Miss Brooks 100. And we actually have a representative here, Lisa Wagner, who's the executive director of the complex, to say a few words about their organization.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having us here tonight and for being with us. I'm very excited to be a part of this. I have the great honor tonight of talking about OMB 100 in the centennial year of Miss Brooks, and also the Guild Literary Complex that's celebrating its 28th year in Chicago. Both of these organizations are looking at sort of outsider voices, those that are not centralist, and that's what we're celebrating tonight. The voices of writers whose stories are sometimes overlooked, and in that, I think, become in some ways more important because they represent so much of the community of Chicago that is just somehow embroiled and is part of and intrinsic to this city's narrative. And I do mean narrative. I'm really excited about the panel tonight, and what the Guild has done for the last 28 years is, in this celebration of writers, is looked to emerging artists and those that are also really instantiated as part of their communities, like Gwendolyn Brooks, which is how OMB 100 and the Guild have worked together. For the last 5 years, we've worked with Brooks Permissions and Nora Brooks Blakely very closely on Brooks Day, which is the birthday celebration of Gwendolyn Brooks, which some of you may be familiar with. This centennial year, we had a really amazing party at Logan Center for the Arts, and it was just such a celebration and such a diverse group of voices coming from every neighborhood in this city, north, south, east, west. And to me, that really, exemplifies the kinds of work that we see at Hull-House and the mission here from Jane Addams Hull-House and the museum itself, but also for organizations like this book specifically, your organizations, but also the Guild and OMB. OMB 100, I'm sorry, Quresh Ali Lansana couldn't be here this evening, but together he and I are doing one of the first translation series of Gwendolyn Brooks' work into Spanish, actually, and we see that as one of the really important missions of the kinds of works on the west side, on the south side, on the north side, that we communicate across language, because language isn't just specific to the parlance that we speak, but also the way we live and all of those pieces of it. So together with OMB 100, if you join us on October 18th, we'll be at the Pritzker Auditorium with the Chicago Public Library with new works of Gwendolyn Brooks in translation. But the Guild is also continuing to celebrate her work. We are in our 24th year of the Gwendolyn Brooks Open Mic Awards, for which she used to write a check. It's a $500 poetry award, really celebrating the multiple voices of Chicago in poetry and trying to create a space that all voices are celebrated, not just specific pieces. And in case in point, in my opinion, JAHHM Bajess was one of the winners for that, and of course he's our Pulitzer Prize winner this year, 2017. But anyway, I don't want to speak and go on, but the Guild Literary Complex, please join us for other events, OMB 100. We'd love to work with Hull-House and Jennifer here, but please come out, and thank you all for the work that you do. We're really honored to be a part of this community.
Thank you. Before I introduce our distinguished moderator, I want to share a little bit about the museum and Making the West Side project that this program is actually a part of tonight. The museum is a part of the University of Illinois College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts. It was created as a tribute to Jane Addams, who was the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, and other social reformers who came to the near west side of Chicago in 1889 and built the settlement and helped contribute to the social settlement movement, where Chicago was actually the leader. At this time, the area was considered a slum and was inhabited by a large population of mostly Eastern European and Southern European immigrants. Addams and the social reformers lived and worked on the west side of Chicago with their immigrant neighbors who were struggling with poverty, racism, gender oppression, and unregulated labor. Addams and the residents of Hull-House fought for women's right to vote, advocated for better housing, fair labor practices, full citizenship rights for immigrants, public health, public education, recreational and public space, public arts, free speech, and greatly impacted public policy. So today at the museum, everything that we do, we connect past, present day social justice issues, carrying on this focus through our research exhibitions, public programming, and education initiatives. We are actually in one of two remaining buildings of what originally was a 13-building settlement. So next door is the main museum where you can see our permanent history exhibition and some of our contemporary art rotating exhibitions. So we welcome you to come back during hours to visit us there. We also are sitting in another historic building that has its own legacy, the historic dining hall of Hull-House, where over almost 130 years ago was used the same way we're pretty much using it now. It was a gathering space for people to come, be together around food, talk about issues, debate social issues of the day, and try to conspire to make the world a better place. You had notables in this room who knew to come here to speak on social issues. So Eleanor Roosevelt, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Gertrude Stein, W.E.B. Du Bois, and many, many others came here and gave speeches and lectures and engaged a wide range of the public. So what is the Making the West Side project about? The museum received in 2015 a grant to create Making the West Side Community Conversations on Neighborhood Change. And this project is building on the tradition of the Hull-House settlement's work for the common good. The initiative allows the museum for the first time to deeply investigate our own historic role in neighborhood change and to situate both the historical and contemporary west side of Chicago in a national dialogue on race, gentrification, and the American city. The project includes the development of new digital and educational initiatives, so watch out soon for our Making the West Side website that will launch any day now. Many public forums, Teachers Institute, and community conversations here on site and also across the West Side with our partners. We are drawing in particular on two touchstones of this history of Hull-House. Making the West Side is focusing on the early years of Hull-House, which were the 1890s, where Chicago, the Hull-House social reformers were facing questions about trying to understand the poverty conditions that were happening in the neighborhood, and created a study, a comprehensive study to go out almost like a census to understand who was living there, what kind of conditions people were living in, and the intention was actually to create social change and to improve the situation for people. We also draw, the study actually resulted in a collection of essays that are really important to this history called the Maps and Papers Project. And it was the first of its kind that produced these beautiful color maps that we're bringing into the projects and connecting that history to the present. The other touchstone of history that we ground the project in is the last years of Hull-House, 1954 to 1963, which saw the destruction of the Hull-House settlement to make way for the University of Illinois Chicago, which we are now part of, as well as the demolition of many public housing projects. And it included a lot of displacement of the communities here. And so we've been trying to bring out those stories more and really reconnect to neighborhoods, but also to our West Side neighborhoods, to elevate all of the great work that's been going on there and connect the history to the changes that we all see happening around us so rapidly. Historically, the West Side of Chicago was a space of disparate neighborhoods, largely segregated by economic and racial difference. The Hull-House neighborhood in the 1890s included immigrants from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with the largest populations from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italian, Jewish, Poland, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, Bohemian, and many other nationalities of people lived within several blocks of the settlement in 1891. In the 1910s and 20s, the Hull-House neighborhood began to receive Mexican immigrants following the Mexican Revolution and African-American migrants from the U.S. South. Today's West Side is also home to a diverse range of racial and ethnic groups with markedly different historical social formations, and is very starkly segregated, representing sizable wealth, housing, employment, education, and racial disparities. And as I'm sure we all know in this room, gentrification threatens to continue to creep west and displace communities and cherished memories. So this rapid neighborhood change is occurring with little cross-neighborhood conversation, and our project, Making the West Side, is trying to connect with one another and with our neighborhoods to bridge some of those divides. We are bringing together people across neighborhoods on the West Side, including scholars, activists, artists, and others to discuss the historic and current issues facing the area. The museum, along with our partners, has been producing powerful discussions and public programming covering issues such as racism, white flight, redlining, urban renewal plans, and policies that have negatively impacted West Side Black, Italian, Jewish, Greek, and Mexican neighborhoods in the 1960s, and exploring 120 years of social change. Our discussions have included why people continue to remain and fight for these communities today, often against forces of re-gentrification in highly segregated city of Chicago. So we held one of these forums recently in April called West Side, South Side, Bridging the Divide, which was looking at the similarities and tensions between West and South Side neighborhoods, mainly Black neighborhoods. Natalie Moore, WBZ's South Side reporter, who was on the panel, ended up dedicating her column in the Sun-Times to the topic in her piece called I Want to Hear Chicago's West Side Stories, and we put copies around available for you to see. And I just want to quote a little bit from that, because this is actually the piece that brought the West Side Literary Guild to us and to the project. So Natalie says, much of the sentiment on stage, she's talking about the panel, and expressed in the audience was that West and South Siders suffered from failed political leadership and steady lack of economic development. What we didn't delve into are the class divides that haunt both sides of town. The established narrative is that Southsiders think they are better than Westsiders. Snooty Southsiders view Westsiders as ghetto hayseeds. Then there's the playful rivalry over whose blues and stepper sets are better. And Natalie realizes that she and all of us can do better. She says, the South Side ends up representing Black Chicago experience locally and globally. When the Great Migration began 100 years ago, in which African Americans left the American South in droves for Chicago, they settled first on the South Side. That history and pattern lent itself to the building of Black institutions such as museums, theaters, banks, businesses, and cultural centers, and thus a bigger, stronger Black middle class formed on the South Side. As the borders of the West Side fade into the ever-encroaching West Loop, the stories and history of West Siders are at risk of being erased and forgotten. And like I said, this is how we learned about the West Side Literary Guild that we're reuniting this evening, who responded to this article, and we're so grateful that the biases and the stigmas that are associated with the West Side were being acknowledged. And I haven't told them that I'm going to do this, but I'd like to read a part of Mark Allen Boone's letter that he wrote me when he first reached out, if I could have your permission. Mark was sending me some copies of the works that he's continued, the works that he's authored, and saying that, giving me the context. They reflect life as lived on Chicago's West Side, a region of the city that Natalie Moore depicted so accurately as captive to the enduring stereotypes that have been insurmountable obstacles to its history being recorded. While I no longer live on the West Side, we who hail from the maligned section of the city nevertheless maintain an allegiance to it, perhaps expressed best by the statement, once a West Sider, always a West Sider. It is the strong identification in the face of a lifetime of put-downs that fuels the hyperbolic boast, the West Side is the best side. When facing down Southsiders who continually look down their noses at us. I've long worried that in years to come, the true identity of the West Side and its contribution to the city's cultural life would be lost forever because of the lack of interest, indeed hostile opposition to its interest. It's why I felt compelled to write and to form an association of like-minded West Side writers that produced this work. And that's why we're here today, to talk about those histories and talk about the Guild. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will introduce the panelists, and we'll start the discussion. Okay. So I am honored and humbled to introduce our moderator, a distinguished moderator, and West Side native of Chicago, Ellis Cose. Ellis Cose is the author of a dozen books on issues of national and international concern, including the best-selling The Rage of a Privileged Class, a novel, The Best Defense, and The End of Anger, a meditation on race in the age of Obama. A Chicago native, he holds a master's degree in science, technology, and public policy from George Washington University and lives in New York City with his wife and teenage daughter. Cose is the senior fellow in residence at the American Civil Liberties Union, which we're very excited about here at Hull-House because of the connections with Jane Addams. His current book project, tentatively titled An Uneasy Conscience, From Wilson to Trump, the ACLU's 100-year-long battle to keep America true, is not just the story of the ACLU's first 100 years, but an examination of America's continuing struggle to be true to its founding aspirations. It will be the first major narrative history of the ACLU in 25 years, which is great. A columnist and member of the board of contributors of USA Today, Cose recently served as moderators of a series of dialogues between the NYPD brass and various communities in New York. Cose formerly served as senior advisor to the Pinkerton Foundation, where, among other things, he produced a short book that looked at 50 years of Pinkerton Foundation grant-making in the context of changing trends in youth development and delinquency. A popular speaker, Cose delivered the convocation address this year at the University of Northwestern in Qatar. Cose began his career with the Chicago Sun-Times, where he was a columnist, editor, and national correspondent. At 19, when he began his journalism career, Cose was the youngest op-ed columnist ever employed by a major Chicago daily. He has been a contributor and press critic for Time magazine, president and chief executive officer of the Institute for Journalism Education, special writer on management and workplace issues for USA Today, and a member of the editorial board of the Detroit Free Press. He has been a fellow of the Gannett Center for Media Studies at Columbia University and at the National Research Council National Academy of Sciences, a senior fellow and director of energy policy studies at the Washington-based Joint Center for Political Studies, and a consultant to several foundations, including the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. And there's more. A longtime columnist and contributing editor for Newsweek magazine, and former chairman of the editorial board and editorial page editor of the New York Daily News, Cose is also an independent radio producer and a popular lecturer and public speaker. He created and hosted Against the Odds, a pilot radio series set in Kenya in the United States, which aired in 2008 in more than 100 radio markets, including 8 stations in the top 11 markets of the United States. He followed that up with a 4-part series in 2009, which also aired on top radio markets across the U.S. Cose has appeared on The Today Show, Nightline, Dateline ABC, Evening News, Good Morning America, the PBS, Time to Choose, Charlie Rose, CNN's Talkback, and so many more. He has also received fellowships or individual grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, and gotten numerous journalism awards. And there's a long list that I won't read, but please join me in welcoming Ellis Cose.
Thank you, and thank you, Jennifer. I'm glad she didn't read any more. We wouldn't have any time for anything else. My job, can you hear me, or I should probably get this mic and bring it over. My job is to be traffic cop tonight, and to introduce the panel and to introduce the topic and what we're going to talk about. And you're going to get a treat because you're also going to get to ask them questions. And the panelists have all agreed, I think, to do a reading of 2 minutes or so at the end. at the end of the discussion, you want to help me like unhook this thing? Yeah, thank you. Great. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
So, welcome first of all to Hull-House Museum. Welcome to this event to celebrate the West Side. And I mean, I was born on the West Side. I still consider myself, as you said, a West Sider. And though it doesn't count very much, I now live on the Upper West Side of New York. But that's, we're here specifically to celebrate the West Side Writers Guild, of course. And we're also, and I hope you get a chance to at least get into this a little bit, and many of us have some connection or another with Gwendolyn Brooks. And so we're also here to celebrate the life, the existence, the beauty, the wonder, the awe of Gwendolyn Brooks. It's impossible to talk about Black life, Black culture in America without talking about Chicago. I mean, Chicago, of course, was one of the stops, the primary stop on the train line that took you from Mississippi or Louisiana, which is where my parents were from, but other places as well. And it's where most people stopped. Some went off to Detroit, some stopped before that, but Chicago was the destination. But what's interesting is that before the 20th century, and even though Chicago was discovered by a Black man, or at least a man who had some African American heritage, there weren't that many Blacks in Chicago. At the turn of the last century, there were roughly 30,000 Black Americans in Chicago at the time. Roughly like 2% of the population of the city. What changed that, and Jennifer alluded to this already, but what really changed that was the so-called Great Migration. The Great Migration, which took people obviously from those southern locales here. And so by the time, from 1900 to 1930, you had a huge increase. You had something in the neighborhood of 235,000 Blacks who were suddenly in Chicago, pulled in large measure, not just by all the ugliness that was happening in the South and by the prospect of jobs in Chicago, but by the Chicago Defender, founded in 1905. Which issued a clarion call, basically, to Blacks in the South that said, come on, come on, come on. You know, there's a place, it ain't heaven, but it's a lot better than where you are. And clearly, a lot of folks responded to that. A great many folks responded to that. And most of the folks responded to that, as has already been made clear, ended up on the South Side. And so by 1940, you had roughly 300,000 Blacks in the city. Over 90% of them were on the South Side, particularly in what came to be known as Brownsville. And the South Side had already developed and was developing a huge tradition, and a literary tradition among others. And some actual giants that emerged from there. The biggest one, of course, being Richard Wright. But you had Margaret Walker, you had Lorraine Hansberry, who was born on the South Side. You had all this activity that was going on there. And that continued for decades as people built on the legacy that had been left. And so you come forward to, 1967, and you have OBASI, the Organization of Black American Culture, where that was basically spearheaded by Hoyt Fuller, who took Negro Digest and made it the Negro World, and made it into Negro Digest, meaning Black World, and so you had this wave of consciousness, mostly identified with the South Side, which is also where Gwendolyn Brooks lived. So you had all of that going on. But the West Side was changing. Even though the West Side had relatively few Blacks up through the 1940s, that changed. And what changed it? Well, a large part of what changed it were the projects. projects which went up in the 1950s and the early 60s. Henry Horner, which is where I came up, went up. I think the first project was established in 53, 54, and they were building through that. You had the freeway, the expressway, which dislocated a lot of neighborhoods and it made the community more fluid in that sense. So you had a huge transition that was taking place. But it was a new Black community. It was a small Black community still, but growing compared to the one on the South Side. And you had, and then it became well known across the world because you had the huge outbreak in 1966. And then the other huge riot in 1968 after Martin Luther King. So then, I happened to live through both of those. And I remember as a teenager, when the first riot broke out, or rebellion, arrest, or whatever you want to call it, broke out there. Walking down Madison Street, which had been the main sort of boulevard for a while, and just seeing all these burned out places and whatnot. And I also remember being in my living room, and there was a shooting that broke out between the cops and a supposed sniper. It probably wasn't a sniper, but they spotted what they thought was a sniper, and they started shooting into the projects across the way. So it's one of the formative experiences of my very young life, and actually one of several reasons why I decided to become a writer. One of the things that I thought was important because I was a reader, and I remember, and I read the coverage of both of those riots, including, and particularly the Martin Luther King riot. And I remember graphically an article in the Chicago Tribune, which talks about how the West Side was a jungle and people needed to be contained. And I said, this is not the West Side that I know. These are not the people that I know. And so I had many motivations, and we may get into that when we talk about Gwendolyn Brooks, but one of my big motivations came from those riots, and came particularly from the 68 riot. And I said, I need to be a voice, and became a voice to try to do what I could to put out a more accurate representation of people who I knew to be something more than what the journalists operating at the time, the majority journalists operating at the time, defined them. So I'm going to call up the panel now. And as I said, we're going to have a discussion. And I'm going to call them up one at a time. And then I'm not going to read their whole biographies because, as I've sort of alluded to already, if we spend the whole night reading biographies, we won't have much more left to do. But I'm going to say a little bit about them, and I will, obviously offer them the opportunity to talk about themselves. And if they will call up, if they will rather come up as I call their name and take a seat. There are 5 seats here around the table. It's a little bit crowded, but you guys are accustomed to each other, so I assume that you'll be able to fit in. So let me first call up the official founder, Mark Allen Boone. Mark is a 1971 graduate, University of Illinois at Chicago, and as am I. I'm not a 71 graduate, but I'm a graduate at that university. He has a degree in sociology, minor in elementary education, a former teacher, former executive with contemporary books. First published novel was Reunion, a novel from the South. It was published by Holloway House in '89. He founded the West Side Writers Guild the next year. And in May 2005, he established Blacksmith Books, a small independent publisher that publishes high-quality works that present a broad range of African-American experiences. His first title and his second novel was published by that house, and it's called The Demise of Lolita Jones. Next, let me call Tina Jenkins Bell, who is a fiction writer, a playwright, a freelance journalist, and an activist in literary science. She lives in Chicago with her husband, 2 sons, and Bella, who's the name of her dog. She also has an excerpt from her novel in progress, Mud Pies, published in the Hair Trigger anthology, and she's currently completing work on that novel. Let me also call up Harold Hunter, who received his BA in sociology from UIC And he worked for many years in the Illinois Department of Employment. And he's currently working on a collection of short fiction, which he expects to complete in the next year or so. Next, I will call up Irene Steele, who came up in the Garfield Park area, later moved to Austin. Her work has appeared in West Side Stories, the anthology, and a collection of writers that we have alluded to already. Some Glad Morning was their debut novel, published by Blacksmith Books, which we've also alluded to already in 2007. She continues to write and is currently working on her second novel. And finally, my old childhood buddy, Dr. Cranston Ramirez Knight. Él es un representante también de los latinos, ¿no? Dr. Ramirez Knight is a historian, author, a freelance photographer of Afro-Latin descent. He received his doctorate from Loyola University, Chicago in American history, with a minor in European modernity. At the rise of fascism, he is the former vice president of the United Nations Association in Chicago, the founder and executive director of Global Voices International, and his writings have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, and he's done many, many readings, some of which I presume some people in here have attended. So that is the panel. If we can get applause for the panel. And I'm going to start with a question that I'm sure you all can answer easily, but I think the people in the audience might be curious to know the answer. And that question is about yourself. And I'm just going to go down the line, starting with you, Cranston, if that's okay. And that is, why did you decide, of all the things you could become, that you wanted to become a writer? What is it that you thought made you, and I understand from reading some of your material that you actually became a writer in the womb and had no choice. But let's assume you had a choice. What made you just become a writer, and what is it that you thought that you could accomplish, either for yourself or more broadly, as a writer?
First of all, can you hear me? Okay, I wanted to make sure I'm clear. To answer your question, I felt that as a vehicle, writing was a really cross-cultural, multidimensional format where I could address the current problems and issues that I was going through and other individuals in the housing projects were living through. So let's mention two of those, which were those two riots, which I also lived through. It is truly amazing. I understand it now, but didn't understand it as a child, to listen to automatic fire and hear bullets strike, go through windows and strike the concrete and have it explode, and suddenly realize that if you put your head up, you're going to lose it. And the first thing my dad, who had been in the Navy, said was, hit the deck and do not get up under any set of circumstances. Do not light anything or they will fire on you. That transformed me, because no one was addressing the issues which were of concern for me. That's what moved me in that direction.
Okay.
I think I love reading, love literature, and I also love conversations. And so I like to write about conversations, just those everyday conversations that really seem so normal but can be profound. But for me, a love of literature and a love of language and words and communications between people, those regular familial conversations, they just make up America. So it's my love of reading that my parents really instilled in me, a love of literature and an appreciation for the arts and for the written word.
So you were an early reader, you read?
Yes. Yes, before that, both my parents encouraged reading, and it just gave me an opportunity to escape not so much here, but just to experience places around the world that I wouldn't have had the chance to go to. So I was reading about apartheid in South Africa before, most people my age, but just reading about the world and just those everyday conversations. I have a love of literature.
My road to writing is basically kind of simple. Like Irene, I liked words, but I also wanted to explore things that don't necessarily have to do with the worst aspects in life, although those things do at some point have to be addressed. And I just wanted to explore a broad spectrum of things that people experience during their journey on this earth. And that's basically why I...
And you thought you could do that better as a writer than as, say, a preacher?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, preaching is a real specific kind of thing, and plus a lot of those guys have unsavory histories. I mean, writers do too, but...
I thought we all writers were all pure now.
Well, how do you define pure? But yeah, that's basically what my motivation was.
Tina?
Anybody remember the penny candy store? Yes. Okay. Well, I wasn't supposed to go there, and I did. My mother found out. I wrote a story to try to avert her attention away from what I did. It worked. And after that, I discovered that writing could affect change, and I've been doing it ever since.
So you were an accidental writer who got into trouble and used that skill to get yourself out of it.
Not necessarily an accidental writer, but that did help. It did help. No, really, I wanted to affect change. As a writer, I'm primarily drawn to stories that are not often told or they're ignored. And those are the stories that really sort of captivate my attention and the ones that I want to tell, because I feel that they're the kind of stories that people look at, say, the abused woman. Okay, and they look at her and they may say something like, oh, she's weak, or she shouldn't have done X or Y or Z. And they make these judgments, and I feel sort of a responsibility to let's just try to go on the inside of this woman's life. And maybe she's not somebody that I know, and maybe she's not somebody that I understand. And anybody who knows me knows I've never been abused, right? Okay. But still, I try to represent those stories in an earnest way, and in a way where people can look at this woman in a different way and sort of try to understand her narrative. And so that is another reason that's a major reason that I write. Okay.
Mark?
I think like Cranston, both Cranston and Irene said, I love to read. I've always read. I've read I can have memories of reading as young as the age of 5.
You were never told that black boys don't read?
Oh, I was told that, but I didn't believe it.
Tell me about the editor.
Oh, what editor?
No, the executive that said he didn't know black men read.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another story. No, it's funny you should mention that. Tina and I are colleagues, and we worked in a publishing company. But the manager of the department, I recall, was telling me that he didn't know black men read. You know, he didn't know they read. But as I said, growing up, I was an avid reader. Many of the authors, my favorite writers, you noted earlier in your comments, Richard Wright. I did read some of Gwendolyn Brooks's works. I especially liked the short story form and a lot of the Southern writers. But what really, I think, motivated me to actually sit down and write fiction was a collection of stories that I happened upon by a writer, Cyrus Coulter, who was an attorney who sat on the Illinois Commerce Commission. And late in life, he wrote short fiction about the South Side. And when I discovered that volume, I was just bowled over because I never encountered stories about people that I could recognize and that I knew and that I felt were speaking like I was speaking, addressing the kinds of issues that I addressed. And I said, if he could do that for the South Side. And he won the Iowa School of Letters Short Fiction Award in 1970. And I said, if he could do that, then maybe I can tell the stories of the people that I encounter day to day in my life.
Let's stay on that for a second, because part of the motivation for this is to explore the West Side and how that has created a literary impulse that is in some ways different than that was exhibited on the South Side. So we'll start with you, but anybody can speak on this as we move along. Your consciousness of being a West Sider as opposed to being a South Sider, your idea of what that meant, and your idea, I assume you were the primary mover, maybe others came to you at the same time, but why this led you to form a guild branded as the West Side Guild? I mean, most of the South Side things, for instance, were not called, the South Side Organization of Culture, but you decided to brand yours as the West Side. Why was that important? What did the West Side represent to you? Both as you were a kid growing up. When I was a kid, I was just told that the South Side had a bunch of mean folks who were mostly sissies, but what was your experience, and what did you later come to what did you bring to the table in terms of a consciousness for the need for an organization that focused specifically on writers from the West Side?
Well, I suppose I could say, in truth, that I did meet writers from the South Side. You mentioned about the South Side Community Arts Group. There are a number of writers that if you wrote in Chicago and were Black, inevitably you would rub elbows with other Black writers, but they all hailed from the South Side. And I never felt welcome. I never felt that they felt we had stories of value that we could share. And as was alluded earlier on, there was always the condescension toward the West Siders. We were put down. And I just felt that because I had not met any writers from the West Side, there were no models for me in my growing up. I felt it very vital that like-minded writers should at least have a vehicle where their work would be embraced, it would be accepted, and that they could bond and we could support one another in promoting stories about our lives as well.
Anybody else want to say that on that?
Well, once again, the question, why the West Side opposed to South? A lot of that has to do with my elementary education. Looking back now, I probably got as good of an education as anyone who goes to an elite elementary school anywhere in the country. All of our teachers were primarily from historical Black colleges. They were not paid a lot. They were not allowed to work in other schools within the city except in segregated sections. My teachers would make it very clear, as with the principal, Mr. Spain, who I dearly, endeared to me. Miss Wilson, I loved her. She was my homeschool room teacher. We were listening to Chopin. We were doing the works of Hammerstein. We were listening to some of the Mozart, Chopin. And no one found that odd or strange. So they imparted in us a real sense of you can do it without saying you can do it, or for that matter, didn't even say it. In fact, I didn't even know you couldn't do it. I thought everybody listened to it because everybody at the school was listening to it. So there was nothing odd about it. It just came very, very natural. she encouraged us to read. She encouraged us to investigate. This is also true with my other teachers. They were invested.
But at what point, Cranston, did you become conscious of there being a West Side separate from the South Side? And
When I told them, when I had a conversation with an individual and said, I went to Emerson, and he said, where's that? And I said, it was on the West Side. He says, you surely received a poor education. And I said, I did? And we had this conversation. So, and the first thing I asked him was, well, which piece by Mozart do you like? And he looked like me and said, Mozart who? I said, oh, well, what about Chopin? Chopin who? Okay, so I at some point realized that I wasn't in a developmental educational system. I was in a very advanced educational system, and that the education I was receiving was very different than those who many were going to the schools on the South Side. And we suddenly realized there's a divide. And what I've learned that validates me, that really puts me in a world perspective. You weren't getting, and yet you're putting me down based on we live 20 blocks from each other.
obviously, Cranston paid a lot more attention in class than I did. I didn't learn the same things he learned. Yes.
If I can add to what Cranston was saying about the schools, as I said, I graduated from Crane High School. And I attended our 50th reunion, 50th year reunion last month. And the coordinators of the reunion, as they opened the banquet, had words of encouragement, and they asked us to sing the class song. And one of them said, you know, this is a class that 50 years ago, the Tribune wrote in the paper that Crane was one of the worst schools in the city, and that no one who graduated from Crane could possibly make any positive contribution to the city. I remembered it, and over the years, the memory faded, but a number of my classmates never forgot it. And they all shook their head in assent when they heard that statement made. And so when you talk about the divide, the West Side, South Side, not necessarily does the South Side perpetuate it. I think the larger city is as guilty as any other in terms of fomenting this this kind of separation. But I can name students from my class who were state's attorneys. I can name a student who was chancellor of the City College system here in Chicago. I can name doctors. If you go down the line, there are a number of classmates who would prove that characterization by the Tribune false in many ways.
Let me, a similar question. You want to say something?
I was just going to say, I thought it was very important that naming, not so much to distinguish ourselves from any segment, but just as important to say we're from the West Side and we have stories to tell. So naming it the West Side Writers Guild, kind of validated that because we have a voice, and so I think the title of our guild was an important way to state that and to help to distinguish that.
Great. And as personal terms as possible, can you tell me what you were able to accomplish as a group that you weren't accomplishing alone by yourself? You're all obviously bright people. You were all obviously accomplished before you decided to make common cause. So what was it that the group helped you to do? Anybody?
So I'm the elephant in the room.
No, you're not. Tina is from Gary, Indiana, actually.
Yeah.
But she went to Gary West Side High School, so she's an honorary West Sider.
So wait a minute, is this a revelation here? So she was an illegal member of the group?
Well, you know what? He funneled me in. I just want to say that.
Just noting that for the record. Go ahead.
Tina's our marketing maven, and so that was how she was hooked in.
Well, and so Mark mentioned earlier that he and I were colleagues. We worked for a publishing company. This is Contemporary Books, yes. And I was writing stories at the time, and I would share them with colleagues, and I would get comments like, "Black people don't talk like that." And I was like, well, somebody needs to tell my mother, because every time I threw anything that was close to slang, she slapped me, because it was legal back then, you know, in the mouth. But anyway, so the West Side Writers Guild took me in because at the time, I didn't have a productive, cohesive platform for sharing my stories and getting that kind of constructive critique that was not trying to make me write in a certain way or tell a certain story. There was no one telling me that there is no Black middle class. There was not that sort of thing going on. So that's a major thing that I got. I got acceptance, and I got people who I trusted, who were able to help me shape and call my stories to a point where I could send them out and get them published.
Are there any legal members of the Guild who have thoughts on that?
I know it really provided structure for me. Being a bit of a lazy writer with starting a lot of projects and not really finishing many, but starting new projects. So the structure and the validation, these are fellow writers meeting monthly. Okay, this is what I have to share. Okay, and getting the constructive criticism, but really the structure. And then I became excited about writing to bring something to the next meeting, you know. And
you met monthly, right?
Right.
How and how serious was that? Did everybody, sort of mostly for the most part, show up every was it last Sunday and ready to be serious?
We were dedicated, yes, and going around the table, and also either providing others with copies and stuff. So just the critiquing, but also just the constructive criticism and the encouragement, but also to say, no, this is not right. This doesn't sound. Did you just write this last night? I mean, just really, And so really, for me, it provided the structure and encouragement that I needed to really compel me to continue writing.
I think for me, it was important to be a part of a group that pretty much did not see Black culture as monolithic. I mean, there are different shades and permutations and different experiences.
Contrasting that with, say, Obasi, which had a different view?
To some extent, I would say yes. But we were very intentional in our formation, in that we wanted to share the whole range of Black experience that we experienced, in our growing up. And we didn't have a so-called party line that you had to toe in order for it to be acceptable.
So to read between the lines, you weren't coming from a heavily nationalistic approach, for instance?
Not at all, no.
I've got to give a plug to Harold here.
Oh, yeah.
Our meetings were exciting. They were dynamic. I looked forward to them. I would get excited and try to shape my work such that when I got there, it was tight. Harold was not only a writer, but he was our philosophical guru.
Oh, yeah.
And he was there. He had his cap on backwards. There may be some music in the back. I mean, he loved jazz. So there was this ambiance. And Harold was a person, we did our parts, but he took this philosophical, I can't even put it into a package, but it was just his presence and it was omnipotent, we're serious.
I think you're having flashbacks of the hot apple cider.
Yes. I didn't want to say anything about the cider.
Harold, you were obviously a key important person, but can you explain to me what a philosophical guru is?
Not exactly. I mean, we talked about a lot of things, and we talked about things that we hoped would make our writing better. I mean, it's not like I had this whole deep font of wisdom, because I certainly did not. But I mean, it's just that we discussed our work, and we discussed other things that even didn't necessarily have anything to do with writing. And we were always respectful, and I think that's really important. I mean, you mentioned the nationalist point of view. I mean, I've had some experience with one organization in particular that toes that particular line. And one of the reasons that even though the Guild didn't come into being until some decades later, it was this absence of a party line. Now, even when I did this volunteer work with this organization, you could see where the direction they were moving. And ultimately, it was something that I just didn't want to be a part of. And eventually I left that group, and, it was almost time for me to graduate from college anyway. And I was thinking more along the lines of, I need to get a job now, and that kind of thing. And so the West Side Writers Guild was just something that I wish had been around, 20 years earlier.
Let me shift directions just a little bit and get into the question of publishing. I mean, that era beginning in the mid-'60s, actually. I mean, you birthed several presses. I mean, there was Broadside Press with Dudley Randall. There was Path Press, started for a little while in Chicago by a handful of people. There was Third World with Haki Mahabuti. And you yourself with Blacksmith Books. Why did you deem it necessary to start a press? Number one, and that leads to the larger question, which is, and again, it's going to be for whoever wants to speak on it, the challenges of a Black writer getting published. But talk about the press first of all, and then we get to the larger question.
Well, first of all, insofar as the press is concerned, during the time we were writing, and I would say early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, there was extreme difficulty in getting your work evaluated, accepted by agents. New York virtually was pretty much off limits. I think they pretty much felt that at the time what was selling was what was called the urban experience, or street literature, street fiction. And if your work didn't, that and even later, So I had written a couple of manuscripts, novels that I'd shopped around and circulated. And one of them was actually agented. And he said that, I'm going to take this on. I know it's going to be an uphill climb because I know what the market is like out there, but I believe in it and I'm going to push it. Well, he shopped it and shopped it. I think I ended up getting maybe 13 rejections or so. And I said, something's not right with this picture, By then, I was working as an editor for a publisher. So I knew the ropes. I mean, I knew the process. I knew the steps that were needed in order to publish. So after enough rejections, I just said, well, I think I'll just probably try and, consider self-publishing this work. And from there, I decided, as part of the West Side Writers Guild, we wouldn't even attempt to try and get it published by a commercial publisher or and so that was how that piece came about.
Because else on the publishing industry, your thoughts on that, and also if anybody has advice, there may be some up and coming writer in the audience who's seeking some advice on what to do. But Irene, I think you wanted to say something.
Right. Well, when I finished my novel and took off the writing head and tried to get into with the publishers, I mean, I got the rejections, but it was in the midst of the Terry McMillan style of writing, or just that whole age. And one agent wrote back to me on my own letter that I had written to her. And she sent it back and said, well, this is a good story, but can you spice it up a bit? Can your character have, a few, she actually said, can she have, a few children, are married? We need to spice it up. And I said, well, this
was a major New York publisher.
Yes. And I said, this story doesn't flow like that. So anyone reading these characters, that's not natural. And so, but they really wanted that type of thing. They wanted a mom, on public assistance, a bunch of different children, or they wanted drugs involved. And, as if that was just the one vein, that you could write. And it was very frustrating, if you had, a novel, that is solid and, but for her to say that this is what they were looking for. And, she said, oh, this is a good write, but we need this. Can you change this or this or this, that type of thing. So when Mark started Blacksmith Press, it was just a godsend, not just for my story, but for those others who had stories to tell.
You mentioned Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines, that Holloway House material from the 60s. The first novel that I shopped, unagented on my own, Reunion, that was the first novel published. After getting it rejected by so many New York houses, on a lark, I sent it to Holloway House because a good friend of mine said, Mark, you ought to send it to them. They'll publish it. They just want anything about Black experience. So reluctantly, I sent it, and they took it in a heartbeat. And I thought, oh, wow, they're going to publish it. Maybe because I have a publishing background, maybe I can have some input in how they market it, and how they package it, how they design it. Because after all, I had been in publishing for at least, 5 years at that point. Well, I had no say-so in the marketing of it. I didn't like the cover. I didn't like the way they tried to position it. It just frustrated me to such an extent that I said, never again. I said, since I have the tools and I know the nuts and bolts of it, of the publishing process, I just as soon do it myself. And so, it was embraced by a number of people. I mean, it was well-liked. It was an easy read, but it went out of print almost a couple of years after it was published. And so I said, well, it's out of print. I said, the rights will revert to me. I'll do it the way I want to do it, next time around. So here again, you're at the mercy. I don't know anybody who has publishers in line waiting to take their next book. You kind of have to take what you can get.
Yeah, and if it was hard publishing 10, 15 years ago, it's even harder now because the economics are different and they're all looking for something very big. But I noticed a couple of people nodding when I solicited advice. So I'm gonna resolicit advice. As published authors, as people who have been through the process before, as people who understand at least to some extent how this industry works. If there are any up-and-coming writers who are paying attention right now, what do you want to share with them?
If I may, first of all, I want to make sure that I'm heard. It's funny. Unfortunately, I have asthma, so things don't come out quite as clear as I would like. Because I am a poet, I receive the same type of rejections. Companies would send back and say, you seem to be right about the universal experience. And I'm thinking, okay, we want more suffering. We want more chaos. And I'm thinking, if I'm writing about the universal human experience, of course that comes in, but that's not what I'm particularly focusing on. And so they would reject my material. The Gill complex, I met Michael Ward, when they first started. And he said, probably the best way for you to first get your work out is to come to some poetry slams. And they weren't called poetry slams in those days. I went to the Gill complex, I started doing some readings. People were really engaged. I really enjoyed the audience, their feedback, and said, okay, I've got something that other individuals can relate to. And so by the time I was with Gillworks, I realized that I had a package. I'm talking about the universal human experience, and that was okay. I was given a validation not as a oppressed, worthless individual, but an individual who had lots of worth and had something to say about human beings in general. So I would say, in terms of getting your work out there, experiment. Go to, I have poetry readings. Go to a lot of them, and we had a lot of poetry readings. We had a lot of readings with Gilworks. You get a lot of feedback from people, and the more feedback I received, the more I was able to tighten my work. So I would say for anyone, and I can only speak in terms of poetry, the more you're out there, the more you're doing your craft, you're speaking before audience, they're giving you feedback. It allows you to hone your craft such that by the time you send it out to a publisher, and also there's a number of books out now that didn't exist when I was sending material out. What are editors looking for? And not that I necessarily tailor my work to what any particular company is looking for, but it does give me some idea of what's out there. Yes, some things still do get rejected. You have to have a second skin as a writer, no matter who you are. But at least there are, at this point, publishers who will accept your work and discuss the human condition. And if you don't even publish your stuff in the States, there are a lot of places in the world where you can send your material.
Anybody, before I shift gears, have any thoughts on that question? Advice for would-be writers?
I just want to add network. It's very important to network. And like Cranston was saying, any chance that you get, try to find a platform where you can read your work. The more that people know about your work, the better. But if you network, go to conferences where you're going to meet agents and publishers and so forth, and you can have a personal conversation. You can share with them your work. That's a good way of getting your work published. I've been doing that for a while. I'm actually a part of another writers group too as we speak, and we do quite a bit of outreach and workshops and so forth. We're constantly doing readings, and we're constantly talking about ways of getting through that or breaking through that sort of glass ceiling. And I find that the more that you acquaint yourself, especially with the professional part of publishing, and it's not too far from any other profession, being respectful, knowing your work, knowing the genre or the category that you're submitting to, knowing the publication. A lot of people will submit to publications and they may not have read it or picked it up or gone on the internet, but they just want you to publish it. So show that respect of letting them know that you know, that you followed or at least tried to get an understanding of the publication that you're submitting to.
So we're going to go off for another 10, 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have questions, there's going to be one or two people circulating with microphones when we do that. So, and we're also going to have a short reading, from people as well. So I'm going to have one or two more questions, and then we'll get to the other parts of the program. And actually, I'll just take this occasion to segue into something totally different. I'm going to just tell a brief story, and then I invite you guys to tell similar stories if you have them about Gwendolyn Brooks. When I was in my last year of high school, I had a confrontation with my English teacher because I was refusing, and I went to Lane Tech, I was refusing to do the writing assignments because I thought they were boring as hell. And so she came up to me and she said, well, Ellis, you obviously are intelligent, you can write well, so why aren't you doing the assignments? I said, because they're boring as hell. And she said, well, what is it that you would recommend that we do? What do you suggest we do instead? I said, well, that's interesting. I've never been asked that question before. And I said, well, it seems to me that the point of this class is to evaluate my ability to write and to research. So maybe you should give me something that evaluates that. She said, well, what? I said, well, I want to write about something. Well, write about what? I said, well, for me, a big experience was the riots. So let me write about riots in America, riots in American history. Let me write a paper on that, and you judge that. So she said, fine, go do it. For the first time in my life, I got excited about English class. So I went home, and 3-4 weeks later, I come back with a 130-page manuscript about riots in America. And the teacher reads it, says to me, comes back in the week, and she says, "Oh, I'm going to give you an A in the course." Said, "But I don't know how to evaluate this. You ought to send it to a professional." I'm going, "A professional of what?" I'm project head. She said, "Well, have you heard of Gwendolyn Brooks?" I said, "Well, yeah, she's the poet laureate. So what?" She said, "Send it to her." I said, "I don't know Gwendolyn Brooks." She said, "Well, she teaches at this place called Northeastern. Send it to her. Send it to her there." I said, "Okay." So I sent her this long manuscript, and don't hear anything for weeks and weeks. And I figure whatever a poet laureate does, they keep pretty busy. So okay. But then I get a call. She calls me at home and live with my folks, of course. And she says, "Young man, you have to come down and meet me." I said, "Wow, okay." So I get directions of where she teaches, how to go to this college. Takes me, 2 or 3 different buses. I get there. And Gwendolyn Brooks is sitting across from her desk. She has my little manuscript. She takes it out. She pushes it across the desk to me. And on the top of the manuscript, she's written in red ink and in blue ink, "One day you will be a great writer." And that was the moment I decided I needed to be a writer. And I mention that not because I was so special, but because she did things like this for so many people. That was just who she was. So anyway, that's my Gwendolyn Brooks story. And I understand that a couple of you have Gwendolyn Brooks stories as well. So I invite you to.
I don't have a Gwendolyn Brooks story per se. It's related though. I did meet Gwendolyn, but I met Gwendolyn through her husband, Henry Blakely. And Henry was a very talented poet in his own right. Henry and I served on the staff of AIM magazine, America's intercultural magazine, the acronym AIM. Henry is a poetry editor, and I was a fiction editor. And so we would have spirited conversations frequently about writing, about what was good, what we didn't like. He would read my work. I would remember reading poems of his. And I remember he was consumed most of the time that I knew him with a book that he had written called Sector Plan, which was the economic plan for economic improvement for blacks, because he was very, very concerned about our economic plight. And he had a very well thought out recipe to address the ills, of the African American community. So, as I said, he was quite talented. Gwendolyn, we spoke a few times. She, encouraged me in the fiction that I was writing, but the most direct critique and constructive criticism I got from him.
Anybody else want to say?
I was lucky to meet Miss Brooks on at least 3 different occasions. I had poetry readings with her. She came to the campus when I was downstate, and one of the professors there who knew I wrote poetry said, "Gwen is coming down. I'd like you to meet her, and I'd like you to be on the same platform as her to read some of her work." And I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. This is, I'm not in the same league. It's not a question of being in the same league. It's a question of sharing your work. And so I got to meet her. I got to read my work with her the first time at the University of Illinois, Springfield, and then twice at Southern Illinois University. Amazing time. Amazing listening to how she could take words and create power and stories. I wasn't quite as polished as she, but I tried. But just being in her presence made a lot of difference, such that I could go back and look at my work and see how I could.
No, she was a wonderful poet, but when I was a kid of, I think 16 and discovered her, I had no idea how good of a poet she was. But what really impressed me was she was a wonderful human being. I have other questions, but I should probably. First, I'm going to ask you questions. We have an agreement that some people are going to do readings, and we're going to do a short reading. So, is everyone going to do a reading? So everyone's
Have a short one.
okay. So everyone's going to do a reading. And I would ask if you can to please keep it to 2 minutes or less. And we have now turned this into an author's reading session.
This is an excerpt from the novel The Demise of Loletta Jones. Loletta Jones was a very unorthodox, unconventional Chicago public school teacher who stepped on too many toes and who had the wrath of the system pulled down on her and met an untimely death. But what I'm going to read is basically an excerpt where she was evicted from an apartment, and a widower, taken by the image of a woman with a baby grand piano on Washington Boulevard in the rain, rescues her. She was wearing a purple hooded rain slicker when I first saw her. I circled the block twice before I got up the nerve to rent the truck. When I pulled up to the curb with it, her eyes were fixed on the ground like she didn't have a friend in the world. She didn't know that I was there to get her out of the rain. It didn't sink in until the two men I hired started to carry her belongings onto the waiting truck. "You want to get struck by a bolt of lightning?" I asked. When she lifted her eyes, it made me think of that statue at Hampton University, the one of Booker T. Washington pulling back the hood from over a slave's head. The chill that snaked up my spine made me feel like I was the one who'd been struck by lightning. I could feel the hair standing up on my arms. I recognized her right away as the music teacher who'd been fired in '92 from Lincoln Manor Academy for the Arts. With all the trees lining Washington Boulevard, why would lightning strike this one? The words flowed out of her mouth like musical notes. "'Cause you draw attention to it," I said. Her eyes got soft and she smiled, showing teeth as perfect as pearls. They stood out against skin as dark and smooth as a damson plum. She had a keen nose that tipped upward just a little bit, but not out of snootiness. It was more like she was trying to sniff a scent that most people don't have the equipment to pick up. Unfold the petals of a dark rose and you'd be close to describing the lips that parted when she spoke. "Worse things than that could happen to me," she answered. "The name's Clayton James Hemphill," I said, extending my hand. "Loletta Jones," she replied, giving me hers. She had been evicted, humiliated before the whole neighborhood, but spoke her name like she was a queen. "Miss Jones," I said, "I got a vacant apartment in a 2-flat I own in Lincoln Manor. It's got 9 rooms, too many for the amount of furniture you've got here, but you're welcome to stay there until you get back on your feet. I don't know what happened for you to be set out in the street, but nobody deserves to be put out on the sidewalk in the rain." "Does anyone ever deserve to be evicted?" she asked. I couldn't answer her because my last tenants nearly pushed me to that point.
Okay. My novel, Some Glad Morning, talks about the city's, Chicago's first Black mayor. As many of you were here the time of Harold Washington, it was just an awesome time. But what struck me when you would go to rallies or demonstrations, the variety of people that you would see, from professional, blue collar, unemployed, older, younger, and so to me that was the story. So the novel's in 2 parts, a part in Chicago and a part in the South. And I'll just, because of interactions, just read a couple pages. Aunt Rose is taking care of her niece, and you know, if you want to know more about the story, I got some copies back there. But, okay, they've just come back from church. Aunt Rose sat in the front of the window in her rocking chair watching the neighborhood. Mildred lay on the floor in front of her reading. "Mildred Walker," Aunt Rose whispered to herself and chuckled. Mildred glanced up and wondered what story Aunt Rose was reliving about herself and Mildred Walker. Mildred Walker, Aunt Rose said the name belonged to a woman that folks were still talking about in Creighton, Tennessee. Mildred Walker didn't take nothing from nobody. She stood up for what she believed in, and if she thought you were right, she stood up for what you believed in too. Aunt Rose often turned to her niece saying, "My greatest compliment to her and my gift to you was to give you her name. Wear it proudly and take it to her on Judgment Day." She always stopped and fixed her eyes on Mildred at that point, unstained. Unstained Mildred Johnson, Mildred called herself privately. The only thing that stopped her from saying it out loud was that maybe someone would hear it and take it up like a chant. And then before you knew it, everyone would be saying over and over, unstained Mildred Johnson, unstained Mildred Johnson. Mildred, are you listening to me? Aunt Rose's voice broke the silence. Yes, Aunt Rose. If you want to meet a nice boy, just go to church. I was just there today, remember? I didn't see anything extraordinary there other than Reverend Giles, Mildred said dryly. I noticed Wilbur Spencer eyeing you from across the pew, Aunt Rose said hopefully. What's wrong with him? Mildred looked up. You mean the one who drools all the time? Are you serious? Aunt Rose pressed her lips together. Nobody's perfect, miss, not even you. Could be the Lord wants you to take Wilbur and clean him up. Make him what you want him to be. Believe me, Mildred returned to her book. The Lord don't want that. You know what we used to do in my day? Aunt Rose persisted. What? Mildred continued to read. If you saw a nice boy in church, first you just stared at him a while and let him stare back at you. Then, when you knew he was looking at you, you opened your pocketbook quietly and snapped it closed real loud. Mildred looked up at her aunt incredulously. That's all it took, and if you ask me, that's enough. You don't need to walk around with your face all painted and showing every single thing God gave you. It don't take all that. Mildred knelt down before her aunt. Yes, it does. It takes all that, plus a good personality, intelligence, and charm. You have to know what to do in the kitchen and in the bedroom, she smiled. Aunt Rose chose to ignore that last comment. Mildred, you make the best lemon meringue pie in Chicago. But what about all those other things? What about them? Aunt Rose, look at me. Mildred inched up until her face was right before her aunt. I mean, really look at me. I am looking at you, baby, and you're a good-looking girl. Aunt Rose took Mildred's face between her hands and kissed it. You're my baby. That's what you are.
I'm going to read 3 poems. The first is entitled Ain't got no blonde curly locks to adorn. Okay, sorry. Ain't got no blonde curly locks to adorn my woolly crown. Ain't got no big house, no fine ride, no decanter to pour my burgundy wine from. No golf clubs, no saddle for my riding steed. Ain't got no scrapbook showing pictures of France, the Seine, the Riviera. Ain't got no little beret from last year's summer trip abroad to Europe. Ain't got no big education. Ain't seen Stanford or Berkeley. Ain't gonna see it, ain't seen it, ain't been to Harvard, ain't gonna be there. But ain't got no slave mentality. And ain't that good enough. It's just good old black me. And that's saying much. The next one is called Cage Somberg, for a political prisoner at Dwight's Correctional Center. Your voice is often heard in the dark, singing blues songs without an accompanist, no harmonica, piano, or bass, drum to play. You sing your songs a cappella, melancholy. Your heart is your only instrument, your silhouette. Against the bars, moaning, singing. Sing your song, Diana Washington. Sing your song, Sarah Vaughan. Sing your song, Lady Day Blues. Singing and lifting notes after note into the tears. Beautiful sounds. Your voice, song, singing. Sing over a song that was sung once again, singing. Still singing songs, vibrating across all the tears, through the bars. They touch, they retouch and touch. They move across. They are living words that are only life in the darkened cabin.
Ain't got no culture.
The final poem, You Ain't Got No Culture. A critical analysis of a friend. You ain't got no culture. The way you act, strut, the way you come on, talk and jive, is you, ismite. You ain't got no intelligent type. You sure ain't. You ain't got no culture. You don't talk no Mozart, Shakespeare, no Picasso, no Rembrandt, no Schubert, no Beethoven, no Dizzy, no Renoir. You don't talk no French, no Spanish, no Russian, no Italian, no German. You don't talk no nothing. You ain't no linguistic art lover. You ain't got no culture. The way you dress, transparent shoe shine, shoes, fluorescent underwear, dog hair, fur coat. You sure ain't no haberdasher. Your hair ain't straight, ain't combed, is nappy. I mean, your fro ain't too tough, ain't tough, ain't too tough, ain't tough. But you real in your own way, lifestyle, doing things. Since I've known you, you've been real, a friend, a comrade, and a brother, doing for your family that which is necessary. And in your own way, you be's bad.
There you go.
Okay. All right, so we already mentioned that I was raised in Gary, and later on, as I was working with Contemporary, I started my own business, and I had a contract over here on the west side in the Lawndale community. And I would write stories about industry and community. And I did tours of the area. And one of the things that struck me was the disinvestment. You know, there is no such thing as people are not naturally violent or addicted to any particular thing. The breakdown in humanity comes as a result of a breakdown in investment in that community. And so I wrote a piece I had a piece published in the Gwendolyn Brooks anthology, Revised the Psalm, called The Last Supper. And it's about a woman who decides that her husband is pure evil and he's got to go. And so one of the things that she does is she compares him to a man who was a good man, but who fell to the candy man after his job was taken. And this is the setting of this is on the west side. And so this is Julia, the lead character, just imagining, talking about Harold, who is the man who's sort of fallen. Julia imagined Harold scratching, rocking from foot to foot, screaming like a woman, the bass stolen from his voice by the heroin he injected, sniffed, and rubbed on his gums. She closed her eyes, seeing terror reserved for strangers in May's eyes. May, who often wondered aloud, where was the man she married, the one who sang to her when their first child was born, the one who worked a dual shift and rushed home to drive her to work at the hospital where she was a nurse's aide, the one who picked up report cards, the one who prayed with the entire family, circling the bed, the one whose dignity was stolen when a felony as a teenager and instant unemployment resulting from AIM Steel moving its operations overseas closed all doors he tried to open until he stumbled upon the candy man. Julia and May shared the same secret, hugged the same pain, though caused by different men. Through it all, both women strove to keep their families whole, praying often that their men would rise to the worthiness of their sacrifices. Unlike Harold, who was caught up by circumstance and bad luck, the good Reverend Doctor, with his mother of pearl skin and cat gray eyes, the product of a black mother and white father, was pure evil. He stripped her soul bare, then stole what little spirit remained by damaging their son. Julia tried to understand how and when the good Reverend became so toxic. She tried to remember what drew her to this man who was kind and caring until the day she said, "I do."
I'm going to read an excerpt from a short story I did for a union newsletter several years ago. It's called Bottoms Up, and it's really the last two paragraphs. Back at the table, Eileen and Buzz have been joined by Lee, Misha, that's pronounced Misha, as she's always reminding everyone, like the British R&B chanteuse, Terrence and Brad. How long have they been huddled in that lover's nook, Lee asked. About 40 minutes. They've been gone a while now. Their conversation seems pretty deep. Uh-oh, look at that. Lacey's tearing up a little, and Mike is gently wiping her tears away and kissing her. And she's kissing him back real strong. Somebody should get this on video. This is primo Valentine's Day YouTube stuff, jokes Brad. Suddenly, the group hears Mike shout across the room, 50,000 what? And Lacey pulling him back to her for more intense smooching. Is that an example of a split tones and multiphonics kiss? Eileen asks. Buzz responds, a reed shredding, pad popping, brass melting example for sure. For sure indeed.
Well, thank you, members of the West Side Guild. And now it's your turn. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please stand. There's a microphone that will circulate to you, 2 microphones that will circulate to you. So make your presence known and tell us your name and the affiliation you may have, and then your question.
Hi, I'm Isabella Bell, and I'm with Chicago Cultural Alliance. My question is, what is your writing routine like? Do you write every single day? Do you kind of binge write? What is writing like for you?
Okay, so your writing approach, your approach to writing and how you do it.
I'm a firm believer in writing something every day. While writing, it's never ever going to be as effusive or flow the way you would like. Sometimes there are periods when you are pretty much consumed. It's almost like something, a spirit, takes over, and you're just the recorder, of those ideas and thoughts, and you're barely even putting pen to paper. It's writing itself. Those are rare. They do happen, but they're rare. But I'm a firm believer in writing something every day, even if it's no more than a sentence, a paragraph, or a page.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to respond to that?
Well, you know what? For me lately, I'm trying to become more like the kind of thing Mark is describing, because in the past I've been too caught up in the muse, and as Mark relates, the muse is elusive. So I've been trying to write, not necessarily every day. I use more like a weekly kind of time frame to try to get down, something on paper.
And I'll just add to that. I think there's a big difference between when you're writing as a profession and when you're writing because you're trying to communicate and you're hoping to get yourself published. When you're writing as a profession, which I've been doing for many decades now, you have all these deadlines and things that are due at certain times and things you have to deliver. And what I find is that I adjust my schedule so I can get that done. But I think when you're starting out, it's very important to have some kind of regular schedule. And some kind, if it's not every day or even every week, it's like, okay, every so often I'm going to check in and do some writing and work on whatever it is that I'm working on.
I agree. Deadlines help a lot, but I write every day, and I also include in my process someone who can critique the work, because the last thing that you want to do is send something out that's not ready, or that's not, how can I put it, been screened in a certain way. Mark's reviewed my work all of you guys have reviewed my work. I have a series of people now who I look to, and we critique each other's work prior to it going out. So in addition to writing on a daily basis, I keep a journal with me. You have a journal? You keep with you? Yeah. That helps.
Next
Yeah.
question.
Hi. A few years ago, I actually wrote a book called.
And can you tell us your name and identify
Oh, I'm
yourself?
sorry. My name is Fran, and I'm from Alabama. I'm a teacher.
Okay.
I wrote a book called Classroom Chronicles just through an online publishing company, but I'm interested in writing again and writing something that's similar to a autobiographical book that's also some fiction. What would be my best way to go about finding a publisher once I complete my book?
Okay, so she wants to write what sounds like a memoir, or this is a memoir-ish type book, and has a question about how to get it published.
Right. I would really look at the types of books that you like to read, and oftentimes in their acknowledgments, they'll mention agents, or they may even mention writing workshops that help them. So the type of book that you want to write, I'd look at those types of books, and in those thank yous, you'll find a lot of gems. Even if that agent doesn't take you, you would still find different workshops that they attended that you could look at.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to handle that? No, okay, next question.
Two quick questions. Why was the Guild averse to national?
Can you tell us who you are, please?
I'm Lee Bay. I'm a former architecture critic for the Shower Center.
And currently you are?
And currently I'm vice president of the South Museum. I was trying not to say that. But two questions. One is, why was the Guild against nationalism? And two, is there anything about the Guild's approach to writing that's different other than location to if there was a counterpart on the South Side?
I'm not sure they said they were against nationalism, but I'll let the Guild members themselves, answer that. And go ahead.
No, I wouldn't say that we were necessarily against nationalism, but I would say that was not the driving platform for our work, for what we chose to write about.
I mean, there's a decision not to do that, not that you didn't get to it. It seems like there's a conscious decision not to go that way. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, let me just say this too. The issue with nationalism is that so many times that it is this rigid worldview, and we just were not about that. The Black experience is way more varied than so many people want to acknowledge. And bringing up this, it irks me with this business of you always have to kind of chant a party line or go this narrow path. And that you can be pro something without trying to jack somebody up. And that was the fundamental problem with a lot of nationalist point of view.
Anyone else on that? Okay. The philosopher has spoken. We have any other questions? Okay. Wait to the mic. It's Steve.
Hello, my name is Terry, and my question is, were there other members of the Guild?
At its founding, there was one other member who went on to write children's literature. She was with the group for probably less than a year, but she felt that because our interest pretty much was in adult fiction, poetry, and the like, that she wouldn't profit as much, in terms of her goal of breaking into children's literature, and has become quite a successful children's book writer as well.
I was told that I should adjourn at 8. It's now 8. There's a final question that just has to be answered. Actually, there are two final questions that have to be answered. We're answering two final questions. then we will adjourn. So first over here and then over here.
My name is Regine Harris-Bialki, and I'm a writer and composer, and I'm proud to say that Mark Boone edits my work, and it's always a great experience. Not always. Anyway, I've forgotten your name, the lady saying to Mark's left. You mentioned that you participate in some writing groups, and I was wondering if you could talk about the groups, who they are, where you meet, and what kind of things you read in the writing.
Okay, so talk about the writing group, the current ones. Okay. Okay. I'm the president of a group called For Love of Writing, CC. Hey, one of our members. So we have, our mission is twofold. One is to synergize efforts to sort of emulate, remember what the music industry did, and where you had a number of musicians and rappers and so forth that were sort of synergizing efforts to help each other, move to the next level of, making it in the business. And so Flow is trying to do that on the literary side. Not trying, we actually are doing that on the literary side. The other thing that we do is because we try to go to disenfranchised areas. South Side is disenfranchised, just like the West Side. So we try to go and offer workshops, free workshops and seminars and scholarships and different things like that to help diverse voices sort of rise. A lot of times, again, I know that we're creative, but professionalism is a really big thing. And so a lot of people don't realize that, if you're entering something in a competition and you don't follow something as simple as the directions, that immediately gets you in what file? What's that file called? Yeah, okay. So that's one of the things that's another part of our mission. It's called For Love of Writing. And Mark, we had him out doing a workshop last weekend. We did a series of workshops with Soulful Chicago Book Fair. And he came out and killed it doing a self-publishing workshop. Yay.
So final question over here.
My name is Lisa Wagner. This is, I understand, one of the last pieces on one of the series, and something Ross and I were talking about was the choice of Gwendolyn Brooks to leave Harper to come to the Third Press is a very conscious decision to work with the Black press. I've heard it continued to be said as a gesture. It's more than a gesture, in my opinion. It's a very conscious political decision, specifically for the Southside Bronzeville writers. And I'm curious, with the Guild as a publishing entity, the two of you specifically as publishers, have you seen that kind of impact on the West Side? And what does that look like for the writers coming up as emerging writers, but also for yourselves?
I'm not quite sure what your question is, so let me. I mean, obviously, Gwendolyn Brooks was a person of immense stature who decided to leave a major publisher and publish with Haki. And that was the statement that she made, and it was well reported. But I'm not quite sure how that.
No, I'm asking that as that conscious political decision to work with Black publishers in a specific neighborhood to start talking about that political.
So, are you asking about the decision to work with Black publishers as opposed to so-called mainstream publishers, and how that plays out with the Guild? Is that the question?
Yes, and also the decision to publish, but also what kinds of impacts we've seen this specific publication and this specific press make in the West Side.
Okay, you guys know what she's asking.
Well, given that the Guild was relatively short-lived, we existed for 6 years. We obviously could not have the kind of impact that a Third World Press would have, given its longevity. Nonetheless, in the brief tenure that we did have, we strove to reach out to those other writers, younger writers, youth, to encourage them to write seriously, to try and get their work critiqued, to get published. we held workshops, a literary festival, where we invited high school students to compete in an essay contest, and we awarded prizes. We recognized individuals who had a significant contribution to writing on the West Side. One being the founder of AIM magazine, who was a West Sider. One of the teachers at my elementary school founded her own magazine, the one on which I volunteered as fiction editor, and Gwendolyn Brooks's husband Henry served. So in that regard, we try to again keep the momentum going in terms of encouraging and in terms of being listening ears that we could listen to those who want to publish and who need tips and advice in going about doing it.
We're going to wrap up, but before I do, if there are any concluding thoughts that anyone on the panel wants to share before we do that, I invite you to do that now.
I also wanted to recognize the Guild Complex. It was one of the few venues in the city at the time that we were thriving to invite us out to do various readings, of which Cranston alluded to Michael War, who was very instrumental at that time in terms of opening the doors to marginal groups like us at that time to be a part of the larger narrative, and we appreciate that, and I'd like to acknowledge that at this point.
And I would encourage those writers to look for a writing group, and if there's not one around, you start one. You'd be surprised once it gets out how many people will come to you who want to write, and then start building a legacy of the literature that way on your own.
Okay, so let me just say thank you for all of you for deciding to spend at least part of your Thursday evening with us. It's been delightful to have you here. Let me say a special thanks to the panel. I think they're owed a round of applause.